Welcome to the Meta Woman podcast. We address the issues, opportunities, and challenges facing women in the development of the metaverse, the biggest revolution since the internet itself. Every week, we bring you conversations with top female talent and business executives operating in the gaming and crypto industries. Here's your host, Lindsay the Boss Poss. The Meta Woman podcast starts now.
Hello, and welcome to the Meta Woman podcast, part of the Holodeck Media Podcast Network. I'm your host, Lindsay the Boss Boss, and from struggle to success, we're covering it all. To all the returning listeners, thank you so much for supporting the show. It means the world to me. And for all our new listeners, I hope you enjoy and come back next week. Today we have a multiple guest episode, which is always so fun because you get to have a good conversation, good banter. I am beyond excited to introduce Dr. Mitu Khandaker, CEO, and Latoya Peterson, CXO, and both co-founders of Glow Up Games. I'm taking a line directly from their website here, but Glow Up Games is a studio games, let me restart. Quote, Glow Up Games is a studio game studio centering innovative storytelling about Black and brown joy. Mitu and Latoya, I would love for you both to further introduce yourselves and Glow Up Games to the audience.
All right, well, hi, and thanks for having us. I'm Dr. Mitu Khandaker, and Latoya and I founded Glow Up Games about 3 years ago. And like you said, we really are all about telling stories and centering stories which celebrate people of color, celebrate Black and brown joy, which are stories we just don't get seen told in video games historically. Latoya?
Absolutely. So a few years ago, we started on this journey. I think, Mitu and I had both been, first friends, and other two brown girls in the games industry. I was writing about games, Mitu was creating games, but we kind of gravitated to each other on Twitter and then in real life. And then secondly, just understanding that, we both grew up in very similar fashions. We've both been playing games since we were tiny. I think Mitu started at 4 and I started at 6. And we just never saw protagonists that looked like us or stories like ours on screen. And, as the years went on and played more and more titles, it just didn't seem to change. And so we realized that, for the change that we wanted to see to happen, we need to get directly involved.
Yeah. And, I'm someone that's I've been in the games industry for 14, almost 15 years. Latoya's been in the media industry for that long. And, we've just done a lot of stuff throughout our careers in our respective spaces. And, we, one of the things that very much, I think, led to the formation of Glow Up Games is seeing how in a lot of adjacent spaces like Hollywood, TV, other spaces where really creators of color and other underrepresented creators are being empowered to tell their own stories and finding a lot of success and a huge audience doing it. And knowing that that is something that could totally happen in video games if only folks like myself and Latoya could step up and make that happen. So here we are.
Yes, I love that whole origin story. Can you all tell me where the name Glow Up came from? That's not a question I had written, but I really like that name.
Yeah, Latoya.
Yeah, so we went through 1,000 names of what should we call
Naming
ourselves.
Naming is the hardest part, I swear.
Yeah. So we went through all kinds of different kind of beta tests. I think we all have different domain names registered in 15 different other alternate company names this could have been. But I think for us, Glow Up, and that whole idea of having a glow up, of making yourself better, of beautifying, of changing something that, needed an improvement, of leveling up. It just felt like that was the right term for what we were trying to do as both a company and as a game studio. We're also just fans of having a good glow up, of watching something come out of nothing and look much better. So, it felt fun and femme. And, I think what was the other word that we use all the time? Space femme energy in terms of what the aesthetic of the studio is. And so, what better way to have a woman of color found a game studio than called Glow Up Games?
Right. I love that. Yeah, I totally agree. Let's start by talking about your game development projects and chiefly the partnership you've developed with HBO and its hit series Insecure, which I hope that everyone has seen or knows about Insecure. I will confess, I am not a watcher. I am an avid BuzzFeed article reader about Issa Rae and the show. Me and TV shows struggle. Me and reality TV get along great, but real TV shows I struggle with. But I will read any article, read any plot summary of any TV show. But I know that you all formed a partnership and / collaboration. Happy to use your language on that, whatever it may be, to create a companion mobile game called Insecure: The Come Up. This is obviously such a huge partnership and accomplishment for a studio and a 3-year-old studio. Just incredible. I don't think it's surprising. Shows me that there's a huge appetite for telling these stories, not only in traditional media, but in newer media, and that there's more than enough room to tell these stories to several different audiences in a variety of ways. So how did this happen? Tell me the whole story of working with Insecure and creating the game, and where you are with the come up and what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, Mitu, do you want to start this one? Or you want me to start it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, so it's called Insecure, the come up game, because it's very much about like building your best life in LA, like, you know, being on the come up, like, you know, all of that stuff. So we, funnily enough, you know, in that period where we were going through a million different names for the company and we hadn't actually decided on one yet, even in those days, you know, we actually got talking to HBO, who have been just this incredible licensing partner. So we have this, you know, licensing deal with them for this IP. And to their credit, and especially the director of digital licensing there, Wilson Price, he very much cared about seeing a show like Insecure, which, you know, for HBO represents like, you know, a huge audience, huge following. It had an incredible 6 seasons. And, you know, I think really just represented, even for people who didn't watch the show, you know, perhaps like yourself, Lindsay, like everyone's kind of aware of it and what it represents. And that for us was like so important. I mean, we're huge fans of the show and of Issa going back before that. But yeah, you know, I think for us, and I'll turn over to Latoya in a second, Insecure very much represented, you know, that audience that we're trying to reach. It also represents the kind of story of like, oh, if you create media, if you tell stories which center Black and brown women, like that can bring in everybody. That can bring in like a huge diverse audience, because it's not just audiences of color that enjoyed that show. They're like a lot of the evangelists, but it brought in everybody. And that's what we're trying to replicate in the games industry. But yeah,
my Twitter timeline was always a mess whenever a show dropped. And I mean that in a good way. Like there was not everyone was talking about it, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, it was a huge cultural moment in a lot of ways. And so I think when we started this whole thing, we were kind of like, oh, like what kind of game will we make? What kind of IP are we looking at? Like we were definitely looking at more original stuff. And then it was kind of like the opportunity of a lifetime. We had to shoot the shot. We were huge fans of Issa from the Awkward Black Girl days, from her YouTube days till now. Insecure was must-see TV. Obviously, everybody had to stop and watch and do watch parties on our own. And so the idea of being able to bring that to life and to be able to bring it to life in our way, you know, not just to make like, there's a lot of, you know, kind of like story spin-offs or like mobile games are based on the show that are kind of like, okay, let's just cash in on the show and then kind of move on. And what we wanted to do was really create a mechanic that was reflective of the show and reflective of, again, Issa's relationship with herself and the mirror. We had this whole foundational idea of hype being a currency and feeling like you have to hype yourself up, hype up your friends, be in the mirror. And so a lot of those things went into the design of the game. But I think the moment that I think about the most is when we had to go meet Issa and pitch this game. And so again, it's like this was normally with a license, you don't do all of this stuff. Again, as Mitu mentioned, like HBO's just been phenomenal partners. And they were like, this is a special thing. And like, it's the first time we're really stepping out of like their usual games category to try to make this work. He was like, we think you should meet Issa. So we ended up meeting Issa and Prentice Penny, who's the showrunner, flying out to LA, rehearsing the pitch, you know, freaking out about it. And then, you know, Issa Rae walks into the room with her team and we're just like, oh God, okay, we got to sell her on this vision. And we started out with this whole question that became kind of like the, you know, raison d'etre of the company in a lot of ways. It's okay. Well, do you play games? And Issa's like, no, I'm not really a gamer. I don't really play. And as we're talking and as we're pitching the idea of the story and just getting into, well, actually, I do play this game with my friends and we have this mobile game thing and whatever. And you find out, like, yes, everybody's playing. Women in particular are playing. We don't see ourselves as players. And Issa was no exception. So we got to, you know, luckily we crushed the pitch. She was into it. Everyone was into it. We got the green light and we started development on the project.
Yeah. And fast forward. And so Issa actually ended up as an angel investor in the company, which is awesome. And so, and now, you know, a couple of years into that journey, Insecure the Come Up game is available on both app stores right now in early access, iOS and Android. So yeah, it's been a real journey.
Yes. Especially through the pandemic. That one we didn't see coming.
Right.
We did not. We didn't see a global pandemic after we launched a new startup. That was not.
No. Yeah, that I think we could do a whole episode on the challenges of that, and yeah, what that was like. I want to ask a foundational question really quick about why you chose mobile as opposed to hardware or PC. I think the accessibility is really obvious in that way, but is there other reasons? Or I don't know exactly what to say, because Latoya, I think you did a great job of saying, part of it is that it reaches a lot of women who don't already consider themselves gamers. I'm in the exact same category. I'm not a PC or a console gamer, totally a mobile gamer. But is there things about mobile that you just think kind of you can't get in a PC or hardware experience, or like what is different about developing a mobile game to you all from your perspective as developers?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's a device that goes with you everywhere, right? It's pervasive. You can pull out your phone anywhere. So that's definitely a huge advantage, especially with the kind of game that we are developing, where it's like, you can play, and to tell you a bit about the game. So it's both sort of part story driven and, part simulation-y. But then there's a part sort of that's a rap rhyme mini game. It's like a freestyle rap simulator. So another way in which Glow Up Games is very different. We have a professional MC, Samus, who is a core part of the team. But yeah, so it's one of these things where, you're like on the bus or whatever, you're like walking down the street, you can just pull out your phone and just start playing. So, I think that pervasiveness is a part of it. But in addition to that, it is kind of what we were saying about that accessibility. Like everybody has a phone, and it's not this thing where it's like, oh, cool, I'm gonna like sit down and play a game on my console or my computer or whatever. So yeah, it's just that immediacy.
Yeah, and also on that note on immediacy, like the other thing too, I think for developing for mobile, which is interesting, is just how much our phones are just like a part of our integrated life in a way that your PC and console, like, in a lot of ways, like you might do other things on your PC, your console is dedicated to gaming, but like when we were doing play tests and like, hold on, my mom's calling. Like just like this, the fact of like, okay, how are we designing around these very real world, like everything on your phone is trying to get your attention at all times. We're trying to call you, things like that. So it's a very different way in which we're structuring like, the player experience in terms of how someone comes in, comes out, considering all the different parts of your life that are filtered through the phone.
Yeah, that's definitely not something I thought about. And I think particularly in the gaming industry, we talk a lot about screens competing with each other. But that's really it's a fascinating way of saying the screens are even competing with itself.
Yeah,
quite a bit, particularly when it comes to phones. And especially so now that we've kind of talked about the mobile and the game side of it, what do you think adding a mobile game to a show, and as you pointed out, Latoya, not in the kind of quick buck kind of way, what do you think adding that companion experience to the show does for fan engagement, both from the side of HBO, who's the production company who wants to see their show get engagement, and from the side of the audience who's watching the show and enjoys it? Like, what does adding that portion do for the overall hype surrounding the show, I guess?
Yeah, Latoya, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take it. No problem. So yeah, a lot of the benefit for having a tie-in game is the expansion of the world. And one of the things that we saw early on, even like I think we weren't thinking about these kind of things when we first started the company. We just wanted to make a game. We weren't thinking about like what the overall huge landscape was outside of what we already talked about in terms of young girls of color being able to see themselves as protagonists. Like, that was the goal. But over time, we started realizing this is a much bigger story. So even like, why don't creators of color see their worlds adapted in games more? It's not like we don't have the franchises at this point. Like half of TV at this point are like these compelling stories about people of color, and you just don't see games coming out of that. And a lot of that, I think, is a lack of familiarity, both with the subject matter, with these creators, and with understanding like how do you interpret. So, like I said, Insecure is a kind of like a dramatic comedy at its core, where it's very funny and it's very like slice of life, but there's also like really serious things, and people don't necessarily think, oh, like a game should adapt to this in the same way. Which is why it took kind of our skills and expertise to say, like, okay, this is how we see a vision for what this could be. It's not just you trying to, run up a score by clicking something a bunch of different times. We really wanted to put a lot of the world of Insecure into the game that we ended up creating. So it's, it was interesting from an HBO perspective. One of the things that our partner, our fantastic partner, Will Price, had talked about when he was thinking about this was just this game was such an important thing to this community. At the time that we were signing the contract, HBO Insecure was the second highest socially engaged show on HBO after Game of Thrones. And if you think about how big Game of Thrones was, I mean, like 21 different countries simulcast, to like this other show, which is dominating Sunday nights. Like it's a huge differential. And so like this idea that it tapped into something that was important in the culture and that should be reflected in a game shouldn't be as radical of an idea as it is. And, you know, and like I said, props to Will for seeing and understanding like, oh, this is our next opportunity here. Like we have other franchises that might make more sense in a traditional game sense, but this is the one that means something. And let's go with that. So I think those are the things that we were weighing. Like I said, it's a non-traditional kind of normally third-party stuff. You don't actually go meet the creators and do all these different things. This is definitely, I think, on all sides a labor of love.
So cool. When you're thinking about the audience that you're building for and what that looks like, are you considering, because there's like 3 different buckets, right? There's the people that will watch the show and play the game, and then there's the people that will watch the show. And then are you thinking about the people that will just play the game without watching the show?
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of the things about this this IP and working within this IP that's cool. It's not like this super like lore filled like world, like fantasy world filled with like things you need to know. It's just about living your best life in South LA and, you know, adulting and all of these like themes that are very relatable to like anybody, and even if you haven't watched the show. So we definitely have a part of our player base that, you know, hasn't seen the show, that is still enjoying it, because ultimately it's about building a world in which you can see yourself represented. And so, yeah, and you're building, you know, you're very much like, you're not playing as one of the characters, you're like creating yourself and your avatar and defining your story. So it is definitely also for people who, you know, haven't necessarily experienced the show.
So cool. Yeah, I haven't downloaded it yet. Full transparency, but I have done a lot of like looking around. I read articles with your MC, like some interviews. Is MC the appropriate? Do you guys?
Many different. I mean, mic controller is absolutely a non-go at all times.
Yeah.
I think her title at Brown, so her government name is Nango Lumba. Her governor name at Brown, I think, is Professor in Practice. Over the rest.
She's pretty much. Yeah, she's pretty much what I call her our director of rap. Yeah. Like that's kind of
there's so many like title. Like she just does stuff. But yeah, like that's.
But reading about the work she was able to do in creating the music element, I was like fascinated. Like so cool.
Yeah, I mean, Mitu, you want to? I mean, that was uncharted territory. I think even for games in terms of just like.
Yeah, totally.
Really seems like it. So yeah, please tell me more.
Well, so here's the other thing. You know, what I think in establishing Glow Up, like one of the things we knew we wanted to do was. Like there is just so much space out there to invent new forms of gameplay and game mechanics that just haven't been explored, because a lot of game mechanics have come, you know, we could get into this as the whole thing, but a lot of them have come from the same context, so the same sort of cultural touchstones and touch points. And so we wanted to very much like explore this very kind of fertile ground for what do new game mechanics look like when informed by our cultural backgrounds. So you know, a natural place to start, because in Insecure, one of the very relatable things that Issa's character does in, you know, from season 1, from the first episode, is she will like rap in the mirror to hype herself up. So we were like, hey, let's turn that into a game mechanic. Like that would be really cool. Because the other thing you often see in, you know, in free-to-play games as kind of a space is, unfortunately, there's not as much kind of appetite for innovation in that space as you would like, right? And so there's often a sort of, you know, risk adverseness. There's a kind of lack of real experimentation. So one of the things we've also done with this is subvert the way that a lot of free-to-play mobile games kind of look and feel and play. Like we've invented this new game mechanic. There's a lot of work. And I mean, all credit to Inongo and other members of our team as well, because one of the things that she has done is taken like the wealth of knowledge she has as an actual rapper. And like, you know, she went through this whole process, which, you know, she can give probably a 90-minute talk about one day, where she had to like take that out of her brain and convert it to a game mechanic. Like, how does she do that? How does she like come up with words? And how do you then make the player feel like someone who can freestyle rap. Yeah. So it's like, how do you, and, my favorite bit of feedback, and we hear this a lot, right, Latoya, is people are like, oh yeah, I can't rap, but this game is really making me feel like a rapper.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how much she put into this idea of like, how do all the words fit together? Because I mean, it seems simple, like as we all talk every day, we always think, okay, this is going, but then trying to translate that into zeros and ones and into like a spreadsheet where values are pulled and this happens and that happens and this happens. And then out of the side, you get this rhyme that makes sense, which was, I didn't realize how much of a struggle that was going to be until we started doing it. But like, yeah, this whole idea of just, and then also like regional context, where we had so many conversations around like, Sam was like, if I wrote Kang, Kang, the way that Texas pronounced king, are our players going to get that? And then we're going, okay, well, players from other countries are going to be Googling, like, does this come up on Urban Dictionary? How do we spell guap? Like, we just had so many of these like random conversations around like, how are we standardizing this in terms of the ways which we refer to it in different parts of the game? Like, there was just so much that we hadn't even touched. The whole concept of slant rhyming and understanding how do you actually train a player to understand these things and to present it in a way where it's fun and playable and that they don't have to feel like they're an expert to be able to actually do it.
Well, and that whole process gives so much agency to an entire art form that has been long underappreciated as well. So breaking it down, that's so cool.
Sam's does a great piece on, what is it, book papers, but it's called like AI a Rapper, and it's all about kind of like the erasure of rappers.
I saw that. Yeah, when I was researching, like, I will find it again.
Again, like, working with the folks that I get to work with, people like, as brilliant as Mitu and Samus and folks like that, like it's just bars all the time when I go back and read. So I was like, wow, we did that. Like we worked together on this thing. Because I was like impressed. I was just reading it like, damn, you're right. Wow, like this is happening. I was like, oh wait, that's our part. We are changing this. But in some ways, it's that weird like unreality, so that we are actually making all of these changes in the industry. That again, until you like step back, I think we're very in the weeds day to day, just trying to make things work. But when you step back and realize, like, oh wait, hey, yeah, the predominant way that rap has been treated in the last 20 years or so is as a commodity. And as an algorithmic commodity. And Samus is reclaiming space through the game mechanics, through what we're doing. It's like, we're always part of bigger conversations. And it's, it's easy to lose sight of that when we're like just trying to focus on like, okay, is this thing going the way we want it to? Are we building this thing?
Are we keeping the lights on? Are we like,
what's going on? But like, like I read that piece and was like, damn, we did that. That was us.
We're doing some things. Yeah, exactly.
I just had someone on recently who said to celebrate your accomplishments along the way. I liked hearing that real-time story about doing that. Because I think it's really easy to get caught up in keeping the lights on and fundraising and all of that. So totally understand, but that was a really nice little moment to hear that you all also have been able to celebrate your wins along the way a little bit. And let's talk about kind of we've skirted around this, but I want to give actual not skirted, but we talked about this, but I want to give context in numbers. So about the statistics for developers in the game industry. So the IGDA does an annual report, the Game Developer Satisfaction Report, surveys over 800 people who work as game developers. The 2021 report found that 61% of respondents identified as male, which is down from 71% in 2019. There's a little bit of movement there. But 75% identified as white, and there's not a lot of movement there. And there's obvious implications about some of the barriers that you all might have faced, or people who look like you have faced to actually enter the space. I found an article from Latoya which summed up diversity in games very succinctly. It's trash. So I thought that was a very good quote to talk about the situation.
To the point, she's not wrong.
Yeah. I don't like clear on the bush either. But I just want to hear from you all how you were able to cultivate, your sense of willpower to keep going, to keep pushing. How you were able to balance that with all of the things that you've faced along the way. Very candidly, I was telling Mitu earlier that I'm having a very difficult week. So a lot of my questions have centered on mental health in this episode. But what have you been able to do to continue to keep pushing forward, to continue to work or hope, or what has your support system been like? Like, just what has that journey been like for you both?
I mean, it's certainly been a journey. I mean, here's the thing. We came to this already having survived in our spaces. Like, that's the thing, like, even before Glow Up, if you look at the number of folks who, have sort of more senior roles in, like, games or media, or if you look at, like, how many women and, women of color, especially people of color, are, in these prominent sort of decision-making roles in these spaces. Like, we got to that even before Blow Up, right? So we've, like, I think if there's one thing that we can talk a lot about and know a lot about as women of color is survival, because it's something we've been doing our whole lives and our whole careers. And I think that informs us, that kind of keeps us, is part of what keeps us going. And to come to that, and then, really with Glow Up Games, we knew it was going to be tough, but it was tougher, for many reasons. It's been even tougher than we could ever have anticipated. We mentioned the global pandemic, which of course didn't help and exacerbated things. But, it's been a journey. I mean, Latoya and I always have a saying that we're like, oh yeah, we're going to write a book one day about, like, the journey we've had building Glow Up Games, because there have been some wild stories, and potential investors, fundraising meetings, people have said some things to us. Like,
you should write a book. I would 1,000% do
that. But I think just to, and I'll turn over to Latoya in a second, but, like, I think in terms of what keeps us going amidst all of that difficulty, it's because this matters to us. Like, it's something that we built this company so that folks can not only see themselves in stories and on the screen, but also so there is a place for people who look like us in the industry, in this space, and we can nurture that talent and we can kind of continue to build space. We're all about that representation, both behind the scenes and on the screen. And that's something that's important and, is kind of, as someone, certainly for me, as someone who's, like, been in the game space a long time, is something that's kind of just really what keeps me going, and as kind of core to the reason I do anything. It's all about, like, how do we make things better for those coming after us, and how do we, make sure we get the space to tell, to have our stories told as well, because we do deserve that, So yeah, that's. I'll leave it at that. Turn over to Latoya.
I mean, yeah, everything that you said times 100, and then there's just layers and layers and layers to why we feel this motivation, why we want to do this. I mean, there's the obvious thing was like, oh, you're both women. I'm like, yes, women, but also, there's this other layer of women of color. There's other layer for us as being brown skin girls, which is a whole other kind of conversation in terms of who gets seen and who is normally represented. And then from there, right, like Mitu is South Asian and I'm African American. Like, those are very, you don't see anyone in leadership roles in that way, to the point where, even like a lot of the heroes, like just trying to find like people of color to be on our board. Who can be on the board of Glow Up Games that is a prominent person in the industry that is a person of color? That number is small. In terms of Black professionals, that number is small, to the point where, it becomes, in some ways, I think for us, easy to meet our heroes, just because it's so unusual to see this thing, to see someone like us making a run for it and trying. And at this point, like, I realized, I was like, man, we've been in business 3 years. Like, the first woman of color to run a game studio that I know of is Jacqueline Beauchamp, who did a studio called Energize. And I think her studio was in operation maybe 5 years, maybe 4, maybe 5. So we might exceed that. And, like, if we exceed that, that's, this is new. Again, every day we're breaking ground and we're looking at a new frontier. And that's tough, right? Like, we talk a lot, I think, as women of color, about being the first in a space and what it means to be the first and to be a pioneer. And the first means, like, you're alone, like, you don't have support, and that people don't really know how to take you or what to do or how to support you in the way that, later on down the line, they'll be able to learn, like, oh, well, this happened with Glow Up, but, if we don't want this to happen to other studios, we got to invest more, we got to do this more, but we're the ones that are, like, pushing that out of the way. So that's tight. I think the other piece of it that, speaks to what Mitu was saying about keep going when things are brutally hard. Startups in general are brutally hard, right? Startups in general, any kind of new venture is hard, right? And then gaming is super hard. And then on top of that, we decided to be people of color, serving people of color in games, which is also brutally hard. And then we made a new mechanic, which is also brutally hard. So everything was just like Dark Souls of game development. Like that's what we've been doing. And so, there's a lot of days where it's like, I don't know if we got it. Like in some days you're like, I don't know if I have it. Like, I don't know if I can keep going. And then something random will always happen. And I'm like, okay, let's try again. Try again tomorrow. Like I was at the nail salon super randomly, no real plans. I was like, let me just get my nails off. I had these ridiculous nails from an event and take them off. So I'm going to go get these nails off and stop at a place I don't normally go. And this guy, number one, it's a man. Number two, it's a black man doing my manicure. So okay, I've seen that before. Interesting. And then I noticed he's covered in Mario tattoos. Covered. And he's got Nintendo here. He's got a neck tattoo of a Windows 95 logo. And I was like,
oh, it's the best. Yeah,
who is this guy? Right?
Windows 95 neck tattoo.
Mitu, I'm going to show you his IG after this. When I saw the Windows 95 neck tattoo, we were in new territory. Because I was like,
yeah, that's awesome.
That was hardcore. So I'm sitting here.
Did you ask him what his AOL screen name was? Because I feel like that's the question.
Yeah, like what's your AIM screen? His name is Nintendo. Like his online handle is NEN10DOE. Nintendo. Like he is not. They called him Nintendo at the nail salon. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, should I ask? Let me ask. Are you a gamer? Absolutely. Oh my God, I love video games. This is my life. And he was like, yeah, I'm a sysadmin. And then he was like talking about this whole winding story about like how he ended up not going into the industry because he was like, oh, I smoke too much weed and I can't be in the industry anymore. But he was like, but when I was doing interviews, I got he was completely covered in tattoos, got tears on him. And he was like, I got a Windows 95 tattoo because I knew if in the interview, if they could see that, they would ask me if I did Windows and that was my specialty. And that's how I would do it. And he's like, I always wanted to get into games and I didn't know how. And I was like, like, all right, like, okay.
Yeah.
I needed to be here to share this knowledge that we have learned. So I was like, if you got a Windows 95 neck tattoo, my dude, like, obviously this is going to work out for you. You are dedicated. It's on all your arms. I'm going to bring him a copy of Reggie's book and be like, go ahead and pose with this whole situation going on right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, and like, I was just telling him, I was like, oh yeah, like games is QA, you need these types of jobs, like whatever. And there's so many folks who are hungry to get in. I mean, after all, players of color overrepresent in terms of people who play and are loyal to franchises and all these different things, but we just don't see ourselves behind the scenes in that same way. And so what ends up happening, I think, Mitu, you can feel free to speak to this as well. Like we show up and it's a different conversation. It's a different conversation. I showed up at something, it's like an Indicate Horizon for students. And, I showed up and I was like, oh, I'm in the wrong spot. Like everybody's like, this is how I became a game developer on the side. Like when I was around the thing and I was like, oh, I'm over here. Like these are students. I'm over here talking about like how to get capital. This was wrong audience, wrong thing. Oops. And then in the chat, in the Discord, somebody was like, hey, I've never seen a Black owner of a game studio before. I feel really inspired by this. Like, it's good to see someone else like me that can do this. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess this is in some ways, us being here is the thing. Like, It's the end. It's full stop. I always think I have to do more. But sometimes it's just the fact that we're here and somebody feels like they can talk to us in a different way. It's the work. It helps. It helps. And also, I think, too, shipping the game, right, Mitu? Like, in terms of, there was so many years of us, like, fighting through the pandemic, fighting through funding, fighting all this other stuff, that it was just kind of like, what are we even doing? And then to see the responses that people have was, I think, the most gratifying thing, because we got the hard part right, which is building game people like. Everything else can be a mess. But at the end of the day, people want to play more of this thing that we make. And like that's the biggest validation, I think.
I like that you said that, or not like, but it's so interesting that you say it's so easy to meet your heroes, and then how you all have been at this for 3 years, and I'm sure you are both heroes to so many people for what you do and the feedback that you've gotten. Part part of the reason why I was so nervous to interview you today, by the way, is I'm like, oh my God, they're amazing. But I certainly hope that pool gets much bigger. But it's also really neat how much you're able to inspire people just by being yourselves. That's that's not not like a win for not having a lot of people that look like you. It is just amazing, like how much territory you're able to cover just by being you, though. That kind of, yeah, I don't know how to phrase that any better, but that's quite an amazing feat.
Yeah, Latoya said it really well as well. Like, it's, some days all you have is the energy to show up, and that's enough, right? Like, that really is. Just existing in this space as who we are is an act of resistance. It's an act of like fighting the kind of dominant ways that things happen. So yeah, that's why we do what we do.
What does Manveer always say? I exist in this industry out of spite. Because it's this idea of like, I will resist to the end.
Exactly. And shout out, so Manveer is the president of Brass Lion Entertainment, who are kind of our sister studio in some ways. They're a diverse AAA games company, so they basically make games for like console, etc. So yeah, we're doing similar work in like very different spaces.
So cool. I wanted to kind of end with a discussion on what it's like to be a startup and what that process has been like. We spoke a long time ago in a previous conversation about building the company and the venture process. And Mitu, I know that you've had experiences building several companies now. I read that this is your third, and you face specific challenges being who you are in the venture space and trying to fundraise. It's wonderful to hear that you had such a good partnership with HBO, but I would imagine that other parts of being a startup and of getting funding have not been as easy. Could you just walk me through what that was like? Any advice both of you have for people who are either working at startups, thinking about starting something? Any tips?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, so that folks know, Glow Up Games has previously raised. So, to date, we've raised 1.2 million at pre-seed. So basically, what that means is, in order to build the game, that's the money that we raise in order to sort of get Glow Up Games started, start hiring people, because a lot of that is not just about building the game, it's about building the infrastructure of the studio, building like the means to then also be able to make other games going forward. So it's been tough, fundraising, and for transparency as well, we're currently fundraising again for our seed round. So basically moving on now that we're 3 years into the journey, we've like launched one game. This is kind of raising again for the next stage to kind of go bigger and keep doing what we're doing. But it's been difficult. And the first time we were raising, and every time we got out to fundraise, like it takes a while. And I think the way I'll summarize that is that often the bar is just higher. Like that's the thing. The bar is often higher for us than it would be for our white male counterparts. That's what I will say. Because it's like when we first went out try and fundraise, like we had this great IP partnership, we had like all of this, we have a team that's kind of got experience, etc. Granted, we hadn't like worked together to ship a game at that point, so a lot of what we would hear is like, oh well, you haven't shipped a game yet, you haven't sort of done all this and done all that. So really, it took us a lot longer, and we actually ended up fundraising from a lot of just amazing angels for the most part. So a lot of individuals, a lot of sort of smaller funds who really believed in us and the vision and what we were building, and basically were on the same page as us. And I think what that taught us is that it doesn't, sometimes it can take longer, but if you've got the right people, that's what's most important, right? Because you're building something that they believe in, that you all believe in, you're on the same page. So yeah, it is tough. And now we're fundraising again. And, we're definitely seeing a lot of these kind of similar tensions, etc. It does help to have like shipped something now as a team. But I will say, yeah, the bar does continue to be very high for underrepresented, for marginalized folks in general in the fundraising space. And the stats definitely bear that out.
Yeah, and definitely in terms of, just our journey from a raise perspective, like we've been asked for so much more. I mean, like Mitu, you had 2 other companies before this. And I remember just like we had this moment where we're trying to get our data room together. And I'm like, how do you, and you're like, I was never asked for this stuff before. Latoya.
Yeah.
Like, we never had to produce this level of documentation. Like, it was a lot more like what we said went. And, it's these subtle little things, this subtle denial of the benefit of the doubt that really characterizes what women of color are facing, like women broadly, but women of color especially, where we have to prove what other folks can kind of just hint for. And I think, and I'm keeping like a little list on my counter because I'm petty, of like people who got funded before us who are now out of business, right? Who got a more generous package and things like that. I just read about another company where the founder has taken another job, and part of me is like, can we just talk about this? Because yes, I just want to know what the thinking was here, because obviously this did not work, but we are still here. What's going on? But it's this idea that there's this higher threshold that we always have to hold ourselves to. And even with results, even with the ship game, even with contracts in hand, for some reason, we're still not as compelling as, a group of, younger white guys.
Yeah.
And that's
which I think the thing I'll say is, that's an interesting point that Latoya brings up, because we are like resilient. Like that's the thing, we like know how to keep going. And it's almost wild to me. Like, this is what I'll say to the venture funding world, which is that bet on people of color, bet on women of color, because we know how to survive. We know how to be resilient AF, right? Like that is kind of one of the things we have to do in the world. And, and that's ultimately, you look at all these traits of successful entrepreneurs, you look at like all of these things. Resilience is the thing at the end of the day. It really is that ability to sort of take those knocks and keep going. So yeah, it's we need to see more marginalized folks get funded. Like that's what I'll say.
Yeah, and then also too, like just to add on to this, because I think money is such a big issue for women in general broadly, but also especially for women of color, because we are expected to do so much more with less all of the time. We're always supposed to make it work, regardless of like the level of funding that you would get. And like all of these things have knock-on effects. And I think that wasn't as clear as it was when we were, in this case, even what we're raising from angels, who are people of color who have done wonderful work in all kinds of sectors, all kinds of things. And check size is smaller because they are also getting paid less than their counterparts. So they have less to invest in terms of like even stuff from like celebrities, right? You can see with like celebrities of color and how their deals don't result in the same amount of money that it would for an equivalent. Like, I mean, Viola Davis is always like, if I'm the Black Meryl Streep, pay me like her, right? But it's like, these things can be multitudes of difference, even with like A-list Black actors, which means they have less to invest and they have less to start studios with and they have less to pay people with. It's a downstream thing. And so like, income inequality, investment inequality, all of those different things have to be addressed for us to start actually seeing strides being made. And we didn't realize how much this was an entire system, an ecosystem. One thing to say, okay, there's a management gap. There's one thing to say there's a pipeline gap, but there's another thing completely to say that there's an opportunity gap, there's an equity gap, there's a pay gap. And all of those factors contribute to why you don't see more studios like us.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And yeah, that's the real pipeline problem to me, is paying everyone who should be. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. But yes, that is in very observant and relevant point. I want to move into our last section because I'm very cognizant that we're almost running up against time. Before we get into that, I'm going to do a quick summary of what we talked about. We began with a discussion on Insecure and the audience it represented and how Glow Up Games wanted to reflect the mechanics and foundations of the show. It's not a quick buck collaboration. It's an intentional partnership to create something for an audience that should be interested and engaged with the kind of content that Insecure puts out, as well as people who don't watch the show. But we won't talk about that. The game is part story-driven, part simulator. It has many great games that incorporate a very original mechanic of rap and creative music kind of stylings and creations on the part of the audience. the reason why you all went with a mobile game, among accessibility and many other reasons, it was with the phone being an integrated part of life, the player experience is actually competing with itself for screen time, but mobile games allow for the expansion of the world of the show, especially for creators of color. And there's a lack of experimentation in free-to-play games, so it's important to invent new game mechanics, particularly since the same types of people have been building games for a long time. So mobile games represent a lot of room for innovation, a lot of room for accessibility, and an integrated part of our lives. What keeps you all going despite the numerous and very unfortunate and sad barriers / situations you're put up against is people seeing themselves in stories and on screen matters. Representation behind the scenes and on the screen matters. It becomes easy to meet your heroes because the pool is limited, which is very unfortunate. Also becomes easy for you to become the heroes and inspire kind of the next generation, which hopefully has a much wider pool of folks. Being first has its own challenges. You're alone and you don't necessarily have the same support that an established industry would have. But some days it's okay to just have the energy to show up because that's more than enough. Being who you are is an act of fighting and an act of resistance in the space that is helpful to inspire other folks who look like you. The bar, when it comes to fundraising, we ended with a little discussion on startups and how the bar is higher for women and people of color to raise money. You all wound up fundraising from people who believed in the vision, which did take longer, but wound up being worth it just because they really understood what you were going for. So it takes resilience, it takes time, but try to stick with it. And women and people of color have resilience in spades. So more of those folks should get funded because they have the fight, the survival instincts to keep going, to go for it, to build. Women are expected to do so much more with less, and people of color have the same expectations. And this has knock-on effects from downstream, upstream, all the way through. So I know that Latoya gave the specific example of Black and brown angel investors have less to invest, which means that there's less to move downstream, which means that you all are having to do less with less resources and then employ. And it just winds up being like a whole pattern. So addressing that stream problem and the income inequality found at the different levels is something that's really going to allow for bigger strides to be made. And that comes from not just going to the end product. It starts all the way back in the venture and funding space and in a lot of other spaces, for sure. So with that being said, I like to end each podcast with the same segment, and it's called a moment of reflection. It's just a chance for you to give any advice to people who may just be starting their career or looking to switch their career or whatever it may be. But what is one thing you would like to tell your younger self about getting into the game industry and being successful?
I think it really is about, it's okay to be yourself and to show up because your community is out there and it's important to find them. So that's what I would say. It really is about like the networks you build of folks who can support you and who, have this kind of shared mission and vision, and, that we're creating a sort of, a studio that reflects that, that is kind of trying to push that forward and make it easier.
Yeah, so I think for me, I was talking to a friend recently who was thinking about returning to the games industry after leaving a decade ago and like going back and forth about like all the issues and, all the stress and all the problems and like why did you do this? Why did you want to do this? Well, here's the deal. It's been hard. It's been brutal. It's definitely taken a lot more than I thought I had, right, in terms of making this work. But I don't regret taking the shot. Like, regardless of what happened, this wasn't just a dream we kept talking about at brunch. This is a thing that we actually did. Regardless at this point of how it works out, we took the shot. We did a whole bunch of things that I think we never thought possible just by participating, by being there, by saying, okay, we're going to step up and do this. Even if it's not perfect, even if it didn't come together the way we wanted it to. And so I think that was the biggest thing that I think surprised me about the conversation. Because we're talking about it and he was like, would you go back? I could go back and, have a nice cushy job and not be broke anymore. It'd be really great. But, at the end of the day, we're doing the thing. And there aren't that many opportunities in your life to just go do the thing. And however it pans out, there's no regrets because you tried it, did it. There's nothing at the end of this, I think we have left everything on the floor. So yeah, this is the best. Whatever it was, this was the best we could do.
That's so great, though. Thank you both so much for coming on. This has been just really, really wonderful conversation. Everyone should go on their phones right now and download and secure the Come Up game. Where else can people find you, follow Glow Up Games, find your work, just keep up with what Glow Up Games is doing?
Well, so we're at Glow Up Games on most social platforms, glowup.games on Instagram, Glow Up Games on Twitter. Mitu is at Mitu K. I'm at Latoya Peterson if you want to talk to us individually. And, we're easy to find. We're always around. Always around.
Good. Thank you so, so much. For all of our listeners, be sure to leave the 5-star ratings and reviews. You've heard me give this speech a million times. Check out other Holodeck Media podcasts, including Meta Business and Business of Esports. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Lindsay Poss. You can catch me Wednesday nights on the Business of Esports live after show. You can catch this podcast in your feed every week. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining us here on Meta Woman. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast everywhere you get your podcasts, leave a 5-star review, and tell your friends, family, and colleagues all about us. Also, make sure to follow Meta TV on all socials to get more of the best metaverse content anywhere. Tune in every week for another episode of Meta Woman.